Dahlia Rhodes never imagined that a simple seasoning container, tucked away at the back of a kitchen cabinet, would reveal the cruelest scheme a wife could plot against her own husband. At 47, after 8 years cooking in the same house in Riverwood, Ohio, she started noticing a disturbing pattern. Every time her employer, Ilara, personally prepared breakfast for Grant Thompson, the businessman would spend the next day writhing in pain, pale, sweating cold, with no doctor able to pinpoint the cause. The coincidences were too frequent to ignore, and when Dahlia finally mustered the courage to investigate the suspicious jar Ilara guarded so carefully, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. What she found was not just proof of infidelity, but evidence of a silent crime that was destroying a good man's life day after day, meal after meal. The decision Dahlia made in that moment would change the lives of everyone involved forever, but it would also put her own safety at mortal risk. Stay until the end to discover how a humble cook became the only person capable of saving her boss from a terrible fate, and how her courage uncovered secrets that rocked the entire town. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window when Grant Thompson pushed open the pantry door, expecting to find the shelves organized as they had been for the last 8 years. What he saw made his heart clench in a way he couldn't explain. Dahlia Rhodes was kneeling on the cold ceramic floor, surrounded by dozens of opened plastic containers, grains scattered around her as if she were conducting some urgent inventory. Her hands were trembling as she scribbled notes in a worn notebook, her glasses sliding down her sweaty nose. She didn't notice his presence immediately, so focused was she on counting every bean, every seed of spice, recording numbers and dates with a precision that bordered on obsession. Grant cleared his throat softly, and Dahlia startled, lifting wide eyes, her face flushed with embarrassment. 52 years had taught Grant how to read people, and at that moment he saw something beyond embarrassment in his cook's brown eyes. He saw fear. He saw desperation. He saw a secret too heavy for one woman to carry alone. Dahlia, at 47, was the kind of person who went unnoticed most places. Always discreet, always efficient, always there when needed, but invisible when not. Widowed 3 years prior, mother to 2 grown children who rarely visited, she found the kitchen of this large Riverwood home her only refuge from the world. Grant reached out a hand to help her up, feeling her palm cold and damp against his. Dahlia mumbled hurried apologies, something about better organizing the stock, about checking expiration dates, but her words came out confused, and Grant knew she was lying. Not a malicious lie, but a protective one, the kind people tell when they carry a burden they don't know how to share. He didn't press her. He simply nodded, said it was fine, that he trusted her work as he always had. But as he returned to the living room, a strange unease settled in his chest. That scene in the pantry was just the beginning of something he couldn't yet name, an almost imperceptible crack in the smooth surface of his life that would soon turn into an abyss. The house where Grant lived was in one of Riverwood's quietest neighborhoods, a Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets rarely stayed secret for long. The property was too big for a man who spent most of his time alone, with its manicured gardens and spacious rooms that echoed the silence of a marriage that had long ceased to be what it once was. Ilara Thompson, his 49-year-old wife, spent more time out of that house than in it. There was always an excuse. Her sister in Cincinnati needed company, had doctor's appointments, was feeling lonely. Grant accepted the explanations without question, partly because their 23-year marriage had devolved into a silent agreement where both maintained appearances but lived increasingly separate lives. He had his shoe manufacturing plant, which consumed most of his days and thoughts. Ilara had her trips and commitments, and they rarely shared more than a few formal meals when she was in town. That afternoon, Grant sat in his private study, the place where he felt most comfortable in the entire house, surrounded by his ledgers and his expansion plans for the factory. The company was his pride, built from scratch over 25 years of hard work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices few knew about. He had started with a small workshop in the back of a rented house, stitching simple slippers that he sold door to door. Today, it employed 140 people and produced footwear sold in 5 states, but success had its price. Grant was respected in town, but he was also lonely. His days followed a predictable routine he had created as a form of escape. He woke at 5, drank the coffee Dahlia left ready, went to the factory where he stayed until 7 that evening, returned home, usually ate dinner alone, read a little, and slept. Weekends were just slower versions of weekdays. Ilara arrived that night, bringing with her the frantic energy that always accompanied her return from Cincinnati. She looked different, Grant noted as she walked through the door, dragging a large suitcase. Her hair was cut in a new style, her nails painted a vibrant red, a color she had never worn before. She barely glanced at him, only muttered a quick greeting before heading upstairs toward the bedroom. Grant stood in the entryway, feeling that strange sensation of being a stranger in his own home. The next morning, he noticed the change in Dahlia's behavior. The cook, normally so calm and efficient, dropped a mug when she saw Ilara walk into the kitchen. Shards scattered across the floor, and Dahlia froze for a moment, her wide eyes fixed on her employer. Ilara shot her a cutting, ice-cold look before turning her back and walking out without a word. Grant witnessed the scene from the hallway and was intrigued. There was something there, a tension that hadn't existed before, an invisible current of animosity he couldn't comprehend. Dahlia cleaned the shards with trembling hands, and when Grant offered to help, she refused quickly, almost with panic in her voice. The following days brought more strangeness. Grant began noticing small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Ilara was waking up earlier than usual and was always in the kitchen before him, something she hadn't done in years. She prepared breakfast personally, pushing Dahlia aside with brusque gestures, saying she wanted to make something special for her husband. At first, Grant was surprised and even touched by the sudden attention. But there was something in the way Ilara watched him as he ate, an intensity in her gaze that made him uncomfortable. And there was something else. Dahlia always found excuses to stay in the kitchen while Ilara prepared the meals, organizing cabinets that were already organized, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. Her face was constantly tense, and Grant caught her several times observing Ilara with an expression that mixed fear and suspicion. 2 weeks after that morning in the pantry, the incident happened. Grant arrived home earlier than usual, around 5 in the afternoon, because a persistent headache had bothered him since lunch. As he entered through the back door, he heard raised voices coming from the laundry room. One was Ilara's, loud and accusatory. The other was Dahlia's, low and shaky, trying to defend herself. Grant walked silently down the hallway and stopped just before entering the laundry room, hidden by the wall, listening. Ilara was furious, accusing Dahlia of stealing food from the house. She insisted she was sure that she had noticed missing pantry items, that Dahlia was taking things away in her bag. Dahlia's voice was almost a whisper, denying everything, saying she would never do such a thing, that she had worked there for 8 years with honesty. But Ilara wouldn't listen. She demanded that Dahlia open her purse right there in front of her to prove her innocence. Grant felt the anger rise in his chest. He was about to step in and interrupt the humiliation when he heard the sound of a zipper being opened. He peeked around the corner and saw Dahlia, tears streaming down her face, holding her purse open for Ilara to search. His wife shoved her hands into the bag unceremoniously, rummaging through every compartment, tossing Dahlia's belongings onto the utility table. A worn wallet, a tube of cheap lipstick, tissues, An old cell phone with a cracked screen, a small framed photo of Dahlia's children. Nothing else. No food. No evidence of the theft Ilara had accused her of. For a moment, Grant expected his wife to apologize, to acknowledge the mistake and the unnecessary humiliation she had caused. But Ilara merely made a sound of contempt in her throat, turned her back, and walked out of the laundry room, passing so close to Grant that he caught the scent of her expensive perfume, an aroma he didn't recognize, something new she must have bought in Cincinnati. What Grant saw on Ilara's face in that moment frightened him. There was no shame, no embarrassment. There was something worse. There was a smile. A small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was there, curving the corners of her mouth as she walked away, leaving Dahlia crying alone in the utility room. Grant entered the room and found Dahlia trying to gather her belongings, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold the photo frame. She startled when she saw him, wiping her face quickly with the back of her hand, trying to hide the tears. Grant felt his heart clench with compassion and rage. He helped her collect her things, carefully placing each item back into the bag. Dahlia murmured that she was quitting, that she couldn't work there anymore, that her dignity had been destroyed, and she couldn't look at Ilara again. Grant held her hand, feeling how cold it was, and pleaded with her to stay. He promised he would talk to Ilara, that this would never happen again, that he valued her work and her presence in the house. Dahlia hesitated, her red eyes searching his as if looking for sincerity. Finally, she agreed, but Grant saw that something had changed. The quiet trust Dahlia had always possessed had been replaced by a constant fear, a permanent vigilance, as if she expected the next attack at any moment. The days following that incident transformed the house into a minefield of silent tensions. Grant kept his promise and spoke with Ilara that same night, but the conversation left a bitter taste in his mouth. Sitting in the living room, with the television on just to create background noise, he tried to approach the subject carefully, saying Ilara had exaggerated, that Dahlia was a reliable employee, and that the baseless accusation had been unfair. Ilara listened to him with a neutral, almost bored expression, fiddling with her freshly painted nails. When he finished speaking, she simply shrugged and said she was protecting what was theirs, that an employee needed to know their place. And if Grant preferred to believe a cook instead of his own wife, then the problem was his, not hers. The coldness in Ilara's voice was something Grant didn't recognize. She seemed to be speaking with a stranger, someone wearing his wife's face but possessing the soul of another person. He tried to continue the conversation, but Ilara got up and went upstairs to the bedroom, leaving him alone in the room, with a heavy silence filling the space around him. Dahlia returned to work the next day, but she was different. Her movements in the kitchen were cautious, calculated, and she avoided making any unnecessary noise. Grant watched her from afar, noticing how she looked into the corners of the house as if expecting to find something or someone hidden. One morning, while drinking his coffee, Grant realized Dahlia had begun that strange ritual of writing everything down in her notebook. She did it discreetly, between tasks, recording times, quantities, movements. At first, he thought it was just her way of protecting herself, of having proof in case Ilara made another false accusation. But there was something more in Dahlia's attentive eyes, a vigilance that went beyond self-preservation. Over the following weeks, Grant started noticing other strange patterns. Ilara spent long periods locked in the bedroom, talking on the phone in a low voice. When he walked in, she would quickly hang up and smile at him with that smile that didn't reach her eyes. Small things began disappearing from the house. A specific seasoning he liked vanished from the pantry. A pot Dahlia frequently used appeared with deep scratches, as if someone had deliberately damaged the non-stick coating. When Dahlia prepared a meal Grant praised, Ilara made a point of interrupting, claiming the food was too salty or flavorless, always finding some fault. It was a silent war happening in his home, and Grant felt increasingly like a helpless spectator. Ronald Curtis showed up at one of the business dinners Grant hosted monthly at his residence. 45, well-groomed hair and expensive clothes, Ronald was a minority partner in the shoe plant, having bought 15% of the shares 3 years ago when Grant needed capital for expansion. He had always been cordial but distant, focused on numbers and profits, rarely involved in day-to-day operations. That night, however, Grant noticed something different. Ronald and Ilara were talking in the corner of the room with a familiarity that hadn't existed before. They laughed softly, leaning into each other in a way that made Grant's stomach turn. When he approached, both quickly pulled away, as if caught doing something illicit. Ronald started talking about the factory's figures, about possibilities for new contracts, but his words sounded hollow, and Grant noticed his eyes constantly drifting toward Ilara. Dahlia served dinner that night with silent efficiency, but Grant saw her observing the interaction between Ilara and Ronald with an expression he couldn't decipher. There was knowledge in those eyes, as if she knew something he didn't. When all the guests had left and Ilara went upstairs to the bedroom, Grant stayed in the kitchen, helping Dahlia organize the last of the dishes. He wanted to ask, wanted to know what she was seeing that he was blindly ignoring, but the words wouldn't come out. Dahlia quietly cleaned the plates, her movements mechanical, and Grant realized she was protecting him from a truth he wasn't yet ready to face. The months passed, and Grant's health began to deteriorate worryingly. It started with mild stomach aches he attributed to work stress. The factory was going through a difficult transition phase, with new competitors entering the market and the need to modernize equipment. He thought it was just tension manifesting physically, but the pains worsened. They began appearing after almost every meal, a burning sensation that climbed his esophagus and settled in his chest like an open flame. He took antacids Ilara bought at the drugstore, but they only provided temporary relief. Ilara, curiously, had started preparing Grant's breakfast personally almost every day. She said she wanted to take better care of her husband, that she had noticed how stressed he was, and that a wife should be more present. Grant was touched by the change in attitude, interpreting it as a possible fresh start for the marriage that had been in ruins for so long. He didn't notice the pattern. He didn't notice the pain was always worse on the days Ilara prepared his meals. He didn't notice Dahlia's attentive gaze, who always found an excuse to be in the kitchen when Ilara was near the stovetop, observing every movement with an almost sick attention. One morning, Dahlia arrived earlier than usual. Grant was in the study reviewing contracts when he heard a noise coming from the kitchen. He found Dahlia in the pantry, the same place where everything had started months ago, kneeling on the floor with her notebook open. But this time, she wasn't just noting quantities of grains. She was checking a specific container, an imported spice Ilara kept in her personal cabinet. Dahlia held the jar up to the light, observing the contents with an intensity that bordered on desperation. When she realized Grant was there, she startled so badly the jar almost slipped from her hands. Her eyes were wide, scared, but there was something more there. There was certainty. There was horror. She quickly put the jar back in its place and stood up, murmuring apologies that made no sense. Grant asked if everything was all right, if she needed anything. But Dahlia just shook her head and hurried out of the pantry, leaving him alone with that uncomfortable feeling that he had just witnessed something important, but couldn't quite understand what. That night, the pains returned with an intensity that scared even Ilara. Grant doubled over the dinner table, clutching his stomach, sweat streaming down his face. The pain was so severe he could barely breathe. Ilara called an ambulance, and he was rushed to the Riverwood local hospital, where he underwent a battery of tests. The doctors found nothing conclusive. There was no ulcer, no visible inflammation, no apparent cause for the incapacitating pain. They suggested it might be stress, irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, or severe reflux. They prescribed medication and recommended he reduce his workload. Grant returned home 2 days later, pale and weakened. Ilara insisted on personally caring for him, preparing light soups and calming teas. Dahlia stayed on the sidelines, observing everything with that tense expression that had become permanent on her face. One afternoon, when Ilara went out shopping, Dahlia entered the bedroom where Grant was resting. She carried a tray with tea and crackers, but her hands trembled so much the cups rattled against the saucer. Grant realized she wanted to say something, that the words were stuck in her throat, fighting to come out. Dahlia opened her mouth, closed it again, her eyes welling up with tears. Finally, she just said he needed to be careful, that he needed to pay attention to what he ate and drank. Before Grant could ask what she meant, they heard the sound of the front door opening. Ilara had returned. Dahlia left the room so quickly she almost dropped the tray. Grant was left alone, looking at the tea she had brought, feeling a strange chill run down his spine. A week later, feeling slightly better, Grant decided to return to work. The factory needed him, and staying home only made him think too much about things he preferred to ignore. But when he arrived at the factory office, Ronald was there, sitting in his chair, fiddling with documents that had been locked in his drawer. Grant stopped at the doorway, watching. Ronald took a few seconds to notice his presence, and when he finally looked up, his face flushed. He quickly stood up, starting to stammer explanations about just checking some numbers, about wanting to make sure everything was in order while Grant was ill. But his hands were trembling as he stacked the papers back onto the desk, and Grant noticed that some of those documents were confidential contracts that only he should have access to. Ronald hurried out of the office, and Grant stood there, feeling the ground begin to give way beneath his feet. He started reviewing the documents Ronald had handled and found discrepancies, small, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Signatures that looked like his, but had slight differences in the tracing. Clauses he didn't remember approving. Share transfers he had never authorized. His heart began to beat erratically. He tucked the documents into a separate folder and took it home, locking it in his private study. That night, Ilara prepared dinner personally again, saying she wanted to celebrate Grant's improvement. She was strangely cheerful, almost effusive, serving him with an attention she hadn't shown in a long time. Grant ate slowly, watching her, and for the first time allowed himself to question what was happening. The pains returned after dinner, worse than ever. Grant's hospitalization lasted 3 days this time, and those 3 days changed everything. The doctors were worried, conducting more invasive tests, searching for causes that remained invisible. His body was reacting to something, but no test revealed what. Grant lost 11 pounds in 2 weeks. His face became pale and hollow, and there were moments when the pain was so intense he could only lie in a fetal position, waiting for it to pass. Ilara visited the hospital every day, always impeccable, always smiling, bringing flowers and magazines. She talked to the doctors with concern that seemed genuine, asking about treatments, suggesting specialists. To an outside observer, she was the dedicated wife caring for her sick husband. But Grant was starting to see cracks in that perfect facade. He noticed how her eyes seemed to gleam when the doctors mentioned they couldn't find the cause, how she seemed almost relieved when they said the symptoms would persist. Dahlia never visited the hospital, and Grant strangely felt her absence. Ilara explained that she had given the cook time off, saying she deserved a break after all the extra work. But something about that explanation didn't sound right. Grant lay in the hospital bed thinking about Dahlia, about her frightened eyes, about her trembling hands holding that spice container, about all the times she had tried to tell him something but was interrupted. On the 3rd day, while Ilara was in the hallway talking on the phone, a nurse came in to check Grant's vitals. She was an older woman, perhaps 60, with a kind, tired face belonging to someone who had seen a lot in life. She adjusted the IV, noted the numbers on her clipboard, and then, almost casually, commented that Grant's symptoms were curious. She said she had seen similar cases before, years ago, when she worked at another hospital. A man who presented the same symptoms: unexplained pain, normal tests, but constant deterioration. They later discovered the wife was putting small doses of high blood pressure medication in his food, doses that weren't enough to show up in common toxicology screenings, but which caused exactly those symptoms in someone with normal blood pressure. The nurse said this, looking directly into Grant's eyes, and then left the room without waiting for an answer. Grant lay paralyzed in bed, his heart pounding so hard he could hear the blood pulsing in his ears. The seed of suspicion that had been slowly growing in his mind suddenly blossomed into a terrifying certainty. He remembered the mornings Ilara personally prepared his coffee, the pains that always followed, the spice container Dahlia examined so carefully. He remembered Ronald in his office, messing with confidential documents, Ilara and Ronald whispering in the corner of the room. All the small things he had chosen to ignore because facing the truth was simply unthinkable. When he was discharged and returned home, Grant was different, still physically weak, but with a mental clarity he hadn't possessed before. Ilara greeted him at the door with a warm smile, saying she had prepared the room especially for him, that she would take care of everything, that he didn't need to worry about a thing. But Grant said he wasn't hungry, that he needed to rest, and locked himself in his study. Dahlia was in the kitchen when he passed, and their eyes met for a brief moment. There were so many unspoken things in that look, so much fear and such urgency. Grant gave a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that he was finally starting to understand. Over the following days, Grant refused all meals Ilara prepared, saying the doctors had recommended a specific diet, and that Dahlia knew exactly what to do. Ilara became visibly irritated, but she couldn't argue against medical orders. And curiously, with Dahlia preparing all his meals again, the pains began to subside. They didn't disappear completely. His body was still recovering from whatever he had ingested for months. But the improvement was noticeable. One afternoon, when Ilara left, saying she was going to visit her sister in Cincinnati again, Dahlia came to Grant's study. She carried her worn notebook in her hands, the same one where she obsessively wrote everything down. Her hands trembled so much the pages rustled. She didn't say anything, just placed the notebook on the desk in front of him and retreated, as if that simple gesture had drained all her courage. Grant opened the notebook and began to read. Pages and pages of meticulous notes, dates and times when Ilara was in the kitchen, records of how much the imported spice container diminished each day, notes on when Grant ate meals prepared by Ilara and when the pains appeared. Observations about whispered conversations between Ilara and Ronald that Dahlia had accidentally overheard, and in the middle of the notebook, clipped together, were blurry photographs taken with an old cell phone, but clear enough to show Ilara and Ronald together on the patio, much closer than business associates or casual acquaintances should be. Grant felt the world collapse around him. His hands trembled as he turned the pages, reading every careful note, seeing the accumulated evidence of a betrayal so profound it cut to the bone. It wasn't just an extramarital affair. It wasn't just infidelity. It was something much worse. It was a conspiracy to slowly destroy him, to take everything he had built. He looked up at Dahlia and saw tears streaming down her face. She stood near the door, ready to flee if necessary, her entire body tense like a violin string about to snap. Grant asked, his voice raw, how long she had known. Dahlia replied that she had suspected for months, ever since she saw Ilara handling that spice container strangely, quickly hiding it when she realized someone was watching. But suspicion was one thing, certainty was another. She couldn't accuse her employer without proof. She couldn't risk her job, her only source of income, based just on a hunch. So she started documenting everything, every small detail, every suspicious coincidence. And the more she observed, the more frightened she became, because the pattern was undeniable. Grant asked why she hadn't told him sooner, and Dahlia broke down. She said she tried so many times, but couldn't find the words. How does a simple cook accuse the lady of the house of poisoning her boss? Who would believe her? What if she was wrong? What if they were just coincidences? She had children to support, bills to pay. She couldn't afford to be fired for making baseless accusations. But then Grant was hospitalized, and Dahlia knew she couldn't stay silent any longer, not when his life was at risk. During Grant's absence at the hospital, something happened that solidified all of Dahlia's suspicions into absolute certainty. Ilara, thinking the house was empty, brought Ronald inside. Dahlia, who had returned to retrieve some forgotten utensils, heard voices coming from Grant's study. She hid in the hallway and watched through the crack of the door. Ilara and Ronald were searching the study, looking for specific documents. Ronald held a folder and read contract clauses aloud, while Ilara took notes on a piece of paper. They talked about share transfers, about how they needed access to the original documents before Grant recovered, and noticed the discrepancies. Ronald mentioned that in a few more months, with the signatures they had already forged, they would manage to transfer the majority of the company into their names. Ilara laughed, a high, cruel sound Dahlia had never heard come from her employer's mouth. She said Grant was a fool, that he was so focused on his factory and his numbers that he never noticed what was happening right under his nose. She said they would soon have everything, the company, the house, the money, and Grant would be nothing more than a broken, sick man. Ronald pulled her close and kissed her, and Dahlia had to cover her mouth with her hand to keep from making a sound. Her entire body trembled with rage and horror. She managed to leave the house without being seen, but that scene was burned into her mind like a branding iron. Grant listened to all this in silence, his face growing paler. When Dahlia finished telling the story, he didn't speak for long minutes. He just stared at his trembling hands on the table, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. 23 years of marriage. 23 years he thought he had built a life with someone he knew, and to discover it was all a lie, that the woman who slept beside him was actively trying to destroy him, was a pain unlike anything he had ever felt. It was as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet, and he was falling into a bottomless abyss. Finally, Grant looked up and thanked Dahlia. He thanked her for her courage, for her loyalty, for risking so much to protect him. He told her she had saved his life, literally, and that he would never forget it. Dahlia merely shook her head, wiping tears from her face. She said she was afraid, very afraid of what Ilara and Ronald might do if they discovered she knew. Grant promised he would protect her, that he wouldn't let anything happen to her, but they both knew those were empty promises. Dahlia was vulnerable, a simple woman without resources or connections. If Ilara and Ronald wanted to silence her, she would have no defense. That night, Grant didn't sleep. He stayed in his study until dawn, looking at Dahlia's notebook, at the photographs, at the meticulous notes. He planned his next steps with the care of a general preparing for battle. He couldn't simply confront Ilara, not yet. He needed more proof that would be incontestable in court. He needed to protect his assets, his company, everything he had built. But more than that, he needed to understand the extent of the betrayal, how many documents had been forged, how much of his company was already illegally in Ronald's hands. In the following days, Grant began to act. He discreetly hired a trusted lawyer in Cincinnati, someone Ilara didn't know, and began gathering documents. He requested a full audit of the factory, saying it was just standard procedure, but in reality looking for irregularities. He installed hidden cameras in his home office, small and subtle, that would record any movement when he wasn't present. And he managed to get a copy of that spice container Ilara guarded so carefully, sending it for analysis at a private lab. The results came back in a week and confirmed his worst fears. The seasoning contained small amounts of a blood pressure control medication mixed so subtly that it would go unnoticed in a casual analysis. The dosage was calculated to cause severe symptoms in someone with normal blood pressure, but not enough to show up in routine toxicology screenings. It was slow, methodical poisoning, designed not to kill, but to debilitate, to make him weak and dependent, easy to manipulate. Grant sat with the lab report in his hands and cried for the first time in decades, not just for the betrayal, but for its calculated cruelty. Ilara didn't just want his money. She wanted to destroy him completely. The confrontation happened on a grey October afternoon, 6 months after that morning in the pantry when everything began to unfold. Grant chose the moment carefully, when he had all the evidence organized, when his lawyer was on standby, when every piece was in place. Ilara arrived home around 5 in the afternoon, bringing shopping bags from Cincinnati. She was in a good mood, humming a tune as she walked through the door. Grant was waiting for her in the living room, sitting in his favorite armchair, with a folder on the coffee table in front of him. Ilara entered the room smiling, but her smile vanished when she saw the expression on her husband's face. There was something different about him, a hardness in his eyes she had never seen before. He asked her to sit down, and the tone of his voice left no room for argument. Ilara slowly sat down on the sofa, her hands gripping the strap of her purse. Grant opened the folder and began placing documents on the coffee table one by one, like cards in a deadly game. First, the photographs of Ilara and Ronald together, in moments that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Ilara turned pale, but still tried to maintain her composure. Then came the bank records the lawyer had obtained, showing suspicious transfers between accounts. The copies of the factory contracts with forged signatures. The lab report on the contents of the spice container. And finally, Dahlia's notebook, with her meticulous notes documenting every suspicion, every observation, every piece of evidence accumulated over months. Ilara looked at the documents spread across the table with an expression that went through several stages. First denial, then anger, then calculation, trying to find a way out, a plausible explanation. But there was no possible escape. The evidence was irrefutable. When it became clear she couldn't deny it, Ilara changed tactics. Her voice became soft, almost seductive as she tried to explain. She said Grant had never truly loved her, that he had always been more married to his factory than to her, that she deserved more, deserved attention, affection, passion, that Ronald gave her all that, made her feel alive again. As for the poisoning, she minimized it, saying she never actually intended to hurt him, only wanted him to be slightly debilitated, less resistant, more pliable. She claimed it was just to make things easier, to make the transition smoother. Grant listened in silence, and every word that came out of Ilara's mouth was like a stab wound. There was no genuine remorse in her voice, only justifications, rationalizations for unforgivable actions. When she finished speaking, he said only one word, in a voice that sounded dead even to his own ears: "Get out." He said he wanted a divorce, that he had already initiated legal proceedings, that she had 24 hours to leave the house. Ilara stood up abruptly, her mask of seduction completely dropping. Her face contorted in rage, and she began to scream, saying she would fight for every cent, that he had no idea who he was messing with, that she and Ronald had lawyers too, that he would regret challenging her. Grant simply pointed toward the door, and something in his expression made Ilara realize there was no more negotiation possible. She stormed out of the room, went upstairs, and Grant heard the sound of drawers being violently opened, of objects being thrown. Dahlia was in the kitchen, and when Ilara came downstairs with her suitcases an hour later, she stopped in front of the cook. The hatred in her eyes was palpable, burning like fire. She knew who had documented everything, who had been the eyes and ears that reported her. Ilara approached Dahlia until their faces were inches apart and whispered something that made the cook turn pale. She said Dahlia would pay for this, that no matter how long it took, she would make sure that meddling cook regretted getting involved in business that wasn't hers. Grant appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Ilara backed away, grabbed her suitcases, and walked out the front door without looking back. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with all the emotions that had been contained for months. Dahlia collapsed into a chair, her whole body trembling. Grant sat beside her, and for the first time since the whole situation began, allowed himself to be vulnerable. He was also trembling, the full impact of everything that had happened finally hitting him now that Ilara was gone. 23 years of marriage collapsed in one afternoon. A lifetime of trust, betrayed in the cruelest way possible. Dahlia and Grant sat in the kitchen as the sun set outside, two survivors of a storm that hadn't completely passed. The following days were a succession of bureaucratic and emotional horrors. Ronald, upon learning that Grant had discovered everything, attempted one last desperate move. He showed up at the factory with his own lawyers, brandishing the forged contracts, claiming he had a legal right to 60% of the company. Grant was prepared. He presented the graphological analysis that proved the signatures were fake, and he presented the original documents that showed Ronald's actual 15% stake. The ensuing legal battle was brutal. Ronald had resources, he had contacts, and he fought tooth and nail to keep what he had stolen, but the evidence was too solid. The judge not only ordered him to return all illegally acquired shares, but also condemned him to pay substantial compensation for the damages caused to the company. Ronald left the courthouse shattered, his face a mask of hatred. When he passed Grant in the hallways, he stopped and whispered a threat, saying this wasn't over, that he would find a way to get revenge. But his words sounded empty. They were just the desperation of a man who had lost everything. Ilara, throughout this time, remained curiously silent. She accepted the divorce terms with less resistance than Grant expected, keeping only half of the couple's personal assets, but none of the company. Grant suspected she had her own plans, her own money stashed away somewhere, stemming from months of suspicious transfers. But he no longer had the energy to investigate. He just wanted her completely out of his life. Dahlia, however, was not so lucky. Ilara's threats were not empty. They started small, anonymous. Phone calls in the middle of the night where no one spoke, just breathed on the other end of the line. Cars driving too slowly past Dahlia's simple house in her working-class neighborhood. Neighbors started asking her strange questions, saying someone had been around, asking about her children, about her schedule. Dahlia lived in a constant state of alert, looking over her shoulder, startling at any unexpected noise. Grant tried to protect her as much as he could. He significantly raised her salary, offered to pay for additional security, but Dahlia refused. She said she didn't want to look like she was benefiting from the situation, that people already gossiped too much about her reporting her employer. In a small town like Riverwood, the rumors spread like wildfire in dry grass. Half the town saw her as a hero who saved her boss from a treacherous wife. The other half saw her as a busybody who destroyed a marriage out of ambition. Dahlia felt the weight of those judgmental stares every time she went to the grocery store, every time she walked down the street. Her life, already solitary before, became even more isolated. Her own children reacted in different ways when they learned what had happened. The oldest worried about her safety and pleaded with her to quit the job, to move away from Riverwood. The youngest was proud of her mother's courage, but also scared of the possible consequences. Dahlia found herself torn between the relief of having done the right thing and the constant terror of what might happen because of it. One evening, 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Dahlia was locking up the house when she heard a car stop outside. Her heart immediately raced. It was late, nearly 10 o'clock, and she wasn't expecting visitors. She peered through the window and saw a dark figure getting out of the car, walking toward her door. Her first reaction was to call Grant, but before she could pick up the phone, the person knocked. A firm, insistent knock. Dahlia stood paralyzed in the middle of the living room, her whole body trembling. The knock came again, harder. With trembling hands, she approached the door and asked who it was. The voice that answered was a woman's, but it wasn't Ilara. It was young, nervous. She claimed to be Ronald Curtis's daughter and said she needed to talk to Dahlia urgently, that it was about her father. Dahlia hesitated, every instinct screaming that it was a trap. But there was something in the young woman's voice, a genuine desperation that made her open the door with the security chain still fastened. The young woman on the other side was in her early 20s, with dark hair and eyes swollen from crying. She pleaded to come in, said her father was having a nervous breakdown since losing the case, that he was talking about doing terrible things, that she was afraid of what he might do. Dahlia, against her better judgment, let the young woman in. What she recounted in the following hours painted an even more disturbing picture than Dahlia had imagined. Ronald had not accepted the defeat. He had spent the last few months obsessed with revenge, drinking more and more, sinking into a spiral of self-destruction. Ilara had abandoned him as soon as he lost the money, proving their relationship had never been about love, only about greed. Ronald blamed Grant for everything, but above all, he blamed Dahlia. He said if she hadn't meddled, if she had stayed in her place like a good employee should, he would have gotten everything. Ronald's daughter cried as she recounted finding notes from him, vague but terrifying plans on how to make Dahlia pay. She didn't know what to do, whether to go to the police, whether to warn someone, but she was afraid of betraying her own father. She had finally decided she had to warn Dahlia. She had to do the right thing, even if it meant exposing her father's sick intentions. Dahlia listened to everything with a heavy heart. When the young woman left, after making Dahlia promise to be careful, not to be alone, Dahlia locked all the doors and windows and sat in the darkness of her living room, finally allowing herself to question if it had been worth it. She had done the right thing. She had saved Grant's life, but the cost had been extraordinarily high. Her peace, her safety, her tranquility, everything had been sacrificed.